In this comparative study, I will be exploring the Afro-Surreal film movement by comparing Spike Lee's 2000 film, Bamboozled, and Boots Riley's 2018 film, Sorry to Bother You. The goal of this comparative study is to explore how oppression is filmically conveyed and concretized through the use of filmic elements within Afro-Surreal films across cultural contexts. The comparative study of these two films is justified as their juxtaposition effectively reveals the variety of ways in which filmic elements are utilized within films from the Afro-Surreal film movement and the progression of the Afro-Surreal film movement across cultural contexts. To begin, Bamboozled's cultural context is that of a rapidly changing New York City in 2000. Emerging from devastating events like the crack epidemics and violence of the 80s and 90s into the rapid technological innovations of the dot-com bubble and golden age of television, Bamboozled's cultural context is defined by the immense idyllicism and ignorance present in such a rapidly developing culture. The film follows a screenwriter and Harvard graduate named Pierre Delacroix as he attempts to get fired from his job at a fictional cable network called CNS. Pierre wants to create television shows with genuine black representation, but is turned down by his obscenely racist boss, Thomas Dunwoody. Hoping to finally be fired, Pierre pitches a minstrel show to his boss, which backfires, leading the show to become immensely popular. Sorry to Bother You's cultural context is that of an immensely diverse yet increasingly gentrified Oakland, California in 2018. The Occupy Oakland protests in the early 2010s, race riots, and police brutality across Oakland's history define its cultural context in the film as progressive and overtly political but still struggling to develop equitable socioeconomic and institutional factors. The film follows telemarketer Cassius Green as he attempts to increase his socioeconomic status. Initially, Cassius lives in the garage of his uncle and can barely afford his rent, but after beginning to use his mystical white voice, slowly increases his status, becoming increasingly caught between the macabre, worry-free, and regal view companies he works for and his own morality. Generally, both of these films feature a similar narrative and institutional context, focusing on a black male protagonist as he attempts to traverse an oppressive institution and gain socioeconomic power. Moreover, both films utilize filmic elements to develop the concept of race as both a social and economic or socioeconomic cultural factor, revealing the intersectionality of the social, economic, and institutional oppression that being black in either film's cultural context results in. Despite this, the differing historical, social, and technological cultural contexts of these films inform and alter the development of race as a socioeconomic factor within them, affecting the oppression that being black in these films' cultural context results in. Both of these films are part of the Afro-Surreal film movement, which is based on the artistic, literary, and cultural Afro-Surreal movement. The Afro-Surreal movement originally began in Africa during the 1960s as a purely cultural aesthetic and evolution from the Pan-African and anti-colonial negritude movement, but evolved into an artistic and finally film movement as a result of Afro-Surreal scholar Scott Miller's 2009 Afro-Surreal Manifesto. In this manifesto, Miller states, "Afro-Surrealists restore the cult of the past. We revisit old ways with new eyes. We appropriate 19th century slavery symbols, use excess as the only legitimate means of subversion, and hybridization as a form of disobedience." In this way, the Afro-Surreal movement seeks to repurpose and critique the Eurocentric perceptions of surrealism promoted by the Surrealist movement to create works that convey the inherent surreality within the oppressive and daily experiences of black people. Furthermore, the Afro-Surreal film movement can be defined as a film movement that refocuses the elements and principles of the Surrealist film movement with Afro-Surreal ideology to filmically convey the ways in which black existence is oppressive and surreal. In the 2010s, the movement gained popularity with works like Get Out, Afronauts, and Atlanta, but has been a prominent part of African and African-American culture since the 1960s. This comparative study will focus on Bamboozled and Sorry to Bother You's uses of narrative, mise-en-scène, and cinematography to filmically convey oppression. The focus on these filmic elements in relation to the topic and task components of this comparative study is justified, as these filmic elements are those that most convey and concretize the presence of socioeconomic, institutional, and racial oppression within these films, and emphasize the varied contributions of these films to the Afro-Surreal film movement. In both films, narrative elements are used to convey the detrimental effects of embracing racial, socioeconomic, and institutional oppression in these films' cultural contexts. The main plot of Bamboozled revolves around the obscenely racist yet commercially successful frame narrative of Mantan, the New Millennium minstrel show that its protagonist creates, examining its impacts with a variety of other narratives. Sorry to Bother You similarly implements advertisement frame narratives about the omnipotent worry-free company's lifetime servitude contracts and programs to turn employees into equisapiens, who are more productive horse-human hybrid beings. Apart from the similar use of frame narratives, Sorry to Bother You's use of narrative elements is generally far more surreal than Bamboozled's. The best example of this is the dialogue motif of the white voice developed throughout the film, in which black characters' dialogue is non-diegetically dubbed over by white voice actors to create the illusion that black characters are utilizing white voices.
Like this young blood.
Hey, Mr. Kramer, this is Langston from Regal View. I didn't catch you at the wrong time, did I?
In the film, this white voice is essential to Cassius's socioeconomic success, but slowly envelops his life and erases his identity, revealing the racial and socioeconomic oppression that institutions perpetuate even in post-racial cultural contexts like that of the film. Surreal narrative elements like this are far more sparse in Bamboozled, with it fully developing more narrative perspectives instead. Throughout the film, Lee develops the narratives of Delacroix's disapproving assistant, Sloane, the two previously impoverished, now stars of the minstrel show, Womack and Man Ray, and the Mau Mau activist group. Sorry to Bother You features similar narratives, but Bamboozled fully develops them to convey racial oppression's intersection with socioeconomic and gender identity within the film's cultural context. Mise-en-Scene elements often seen in Afro-surreal films are also utilized to concretize oppression in these films. In Bamboozled, the progressive use of blackface in the costumes and makeup of the audiences watching the minstrel show allude to society's broad acceptance and normalization of racial oppression. Throughout the film, close-up and medium shots are used to emphasize the expressions and costumes of audiences at the minstrel show. Over time, more audience members wear blackface makeup, their expressions turning from fear and concern to glee. This progression acts as a visual motif in allusion to the normalization of racial oppression within the film's society. In contrast to this, Sorry to Bother You primarily uses mise-en-scène within setting and decor to concretize oppression and its effects. One of the most compelling examples of this is the decor of the elevator in the Regal View building where Cassius works. When Cassius is promoted to power caller, he finally enters the elevator to the upper floors, which is laden in gold, red velvet, a chandelier, and has an exorbitantly long elevator code necessary to ensure it remains
very secure.
Through its mise-en-scène, the elevator is a satirical allusion to high socioeconomic status and the absurdity of transitioning between socioeconomic levels as a black man. With the exception of the immensely surreal Equisapien costume and makeup motif alluded to previously. In Sorry to Bother You, mise-en-scène is used to emphasize this reality of racial, socioeconomic, and institutional oppression within the film in far more latent ways than Bamboozled, which uses mise-en-scène to critique oppression far more overtly and literally. Lastly, elements of cinematography within each film are used to convey and subtly highlight oppression within these films' cultural contexts, while also contributing to the personalization and surreality essential to Afro-surreal film. The majority of Bamboozled was shot on handheld digital cameras. The use of these cameras detracts from the film's visual quality, but allowed Spike Lee to utilize a variety of multi-camera setups, Dutch tilt close-ups, dolly zooms, and other techniques that wouldn't have been possible with larger film cameras. Access to these techniques allowed Lee to immerse viewers within the film and emphasize the few shots he chose to shoot on film cameras. Whenever the minstrel show or other obscenely racist media are shown in the film, they are filmed with film cameras instead of digital cameras. This change in visual quality is an allusion to the economic gain and cultural approval that the commodification of blackness in the film's cultural context results in. In contrast, Sorry to Bother You implements elements of cinematography in a far more direct way. Throughout the film, close-ups and static shots are used to create intimacy with surreal subjects and emphasize the surreality of the oppression that economic systems and institutions have created within the film's cultural context. The film occasionally utilizes dolly zooms, anamorphic lenses, and extreme close-ups, but generally treats the camera and its movements more statically. Bamboozled utilizes the camera and elements of cinematography more narratively, inserting the viewer within scenes as if they were observers within them. Despite this contrast, both films use their cinematography to reveal the detrimental effects of the oppressive systems within their cultural contexts. In his ubiquitous Afro-Surreal manifesto, Scott Miller states, "Afro-Surreal presupposes that beyond the visible world, there is an invisible world striving to manifest, and it is our job to uncover it. Like the African Surrealists, Afro-Surrealists recognize that nature, including human nature, generates more surreal experiences than any other process could hope to produce." In both Sorry to Bother You and Bamboozled, this invisible world is explored and made tangible through the use of filmic elements. Bamboozled utilizes elements of narrative, mise-en-scène, and cinematography to challenge viewer perceptions of racism and oppression and scrutinize the extent to which society and entertainment in the golden age of television and dot-com bubble relied on the commodification, institutional, and socioeconomic oppression of black people. Sorry to Bother You also uses these filmic elements to reveal the institutional and socioeconomic oppression that so pervade a post-racial America and illustrate the fundamental ways in which racial and socioeconomic oppression are connected. Furthermore, Bamboozled is a far less fantastical film than Sorry to Bother You due to its cultural context and use of these filmic elements. The stark and chilling tone of Bamboozled is representative of the conservative political and racial climate of a 2000s New York City. Sorry to Bother You is far more satirical and fantastical, as its post-racial 2010s cultural context gives it the ability to be. These differences in cultural context and implementation of filmic elements created vastly different films, but both are equally essential members of the Afro-Surreal film movement. Both films utilize filmic elements to convey that Afro-surreality isn't necessarily fantasy. The oppression experienced by black people within these films is ridiculous and surreal, but it is also a painful reflection of the reality of black existence within society and oppressive cultural contexts.